today's topic is, why is patriarchy or matriarchy inherently broken? That's our topic today. So definitely more in the hot topic range in terms of what we're going to chat about. Obviously, this is exclusively based on our opinions and our feelings and our own individual experiences. And of course, this is a safe space, I hope, for everybody, whether you're listening or participating, or maybe this is engaging you in your own independent thought, and then it takes you off into conversations with people in your life. Just know that, like, everybody has a right to their opinion and the right to their thoughts. I will say opinions are not to be confused with facts. I feel like that seems to be a thing these days. People seem to be confusing opinions with facts, two very, very different things. So I do want to be clear in sharing that today, in terms of this topic of why we think matriarchy or patriarchy is inherently broken, is exclusively an opinion, and it's exclusively based on our own personal and individual experiences. So I just want to kind of put that out there before we jump right into it. Speaking of experiences, I wanted to give a little, as I always like to do in these videos, is give some context about why I have the views and opinions I have. And I'll actually share, I think, something that I hope people think is pretty interesting. So if you've been around for a little bit and you've seen my other videos, you've probably picked up on the fact that not only was I raised in a pretty like traditional nuclear family, mom and dad, who, were married for over 50 years. And both of them had very similar values, which is, I believe, what brought them together, even though I'm biracial. So, I grew up, they came from very different cultures, but ultimately their foundation that they found between Filipino culture and also in terms of American and European culture specifically, because my father's comes from German descent, that what they actually found their values the same was as is being very dedicated, and as my father would describe himself, as an Orthodox Catholic. So somebody who, like, this being Catholic was very much our culture, I feel, growing up, and it was our foundational culture. And I was a part of a parish that was very active. As a matter of fact, we had over 4,000 families. It was a huge parish. It was out in kind of this borderline suburb slash rural type of community when I was growing up. Now it's, blown up and there's tons of people that live there, but nonetheless, that's how it was when Kristen and I were growing up there. But I think what maybe people might find interesting is to learn that, if you aren't Catholic, or if you maybe had, unfortunately, bad experiences of Catholicism growing up, and then it made you leave the church and leave religion maybe altogether, is to really learn that it's because it is the largest church in the world. And, that as a result of that, there's actually many, many pieces and different orders that are within the Catholic Church. I actually was raised in a parish, and it was pretty unique because the order that our parish was actually Marianist, and not many people know of it. If you do, it's probably likely because you went to a Marianist college or high school. And I would say the Marianists were typically attached to two missions. One was education, and the other was social justice. Was a big part of the value system behind the Marianists. And the really interesting part is, I would tell you, even though Maryland is definitely considered to be a very progressive state, the county that we grew up in Carroll County, is definitely known for being more conservative. And then to have a parish of this size in that particular county that was actually considered to be extremely progressive as a parish, because of the fact that we were Marianists. And one of the big parts of being a Marianist was the fact that there was not a belief in hierarchy. And I'm sure you're probably kind of like sitting there going, what? What do you mean? Catholic, like literally, yeah, like the Catholic Church practically invented, the concept of hierarchy. And it's hard to believe that there would actually be an order that one of the basic fundamental values behind this order was not having a belief in hierarchy. And so, as a matter of fact, evidence of that rang through in terms of, if you look at every other part of the Catholic Church, especially if it's like an archdiocesan A part of that is that there's very much a hierarchy in place, and it's based on whether you're like a high-ranking priest or a bishop or a cardinal, or in specific to the archdiocese, a monsignor. So there were certain titles that were associated with a ranking order, within the Catholic Church as a whole, and within pretty much every order, with the exception of the Marianists. In the case of the Marianists, you could have the leadership role, the person who's the leader. Really, also the Marianists were made up of councils. It was a lot of like councils that would come together. But the highest ranking person didn't have to be a priest. It didn't have to be like a monsignor or somebody that was kind of like of this specialized title. That a lot of times the head leader, the person who was in charge of that particular province, would be a brother. And so that part of it was not a part of the value system. So I really grew up that way, even though I was raised Catholic, even though I was a youth minister for 10 years in the Catholic Church. Like, I wasn't raised with any appreciation for hierarchy. I also wasn't really raised by my parents. Again, here's the irony: as traditional as they were, they did not raise me to hold religious up on any kind of pedestal. We saw them as other men, other women. We were all people. We were all of equal value. There was no magical authority that they had over me or anybody else. Now, does that mean that you don't treat each other with respect? Of course you treat people with respect, but I was raised to treat everyone with respect, regardless of age, regardless of color, regardless of gender, regardless of anything, regardless if you're a religious person, regardless if you're some high ranking official. Like, it didn't matter. Everybody deserved respect and be treated with dignity, and we spoke to each other that way. So that's hopefully gives you a little bit of a background and a foundation for why I have the opinion I have in terms of patriarchy and matriarchy, and it'll give you some good context. But I'm gonna give Kristen the same opportunity. Kristen, what was your experience growing up and through your adult life that maybe like influenced your opinions around hierarchy in general, or patriarchy and matriarchy specifically?
Well, first, as you're talking about your experience and really our experience in the church growing up, because I grew up Lutheran, and in like middle school time frame, I started going to church more and more with Angela and her family, because we were, always having sleepovers on the weekends. So I would go to church with her, and then I would go to youth group with her, and then really found a home in her church as well. And to me, that Marianist community was Catholicism, right? I didn't really know anything different.
Yep.
I didn't grow up or have anyone that I knew grow, in my family grow up in a traditional Roman Catholic church. So to me, that's what I knew. So even going into like my 20s, I actually decided, before I got married to a Catholic, I actually decided, you know what, I've been going to a Catholic church for so long. I've been practicing Catholicism. I want to really learn more about it. So I enrolled in the RCIA class, and then ended up converting to Catholicism. And through my life, after the couple years after that, when I would share this with people that I was meeting, I got really negative response. And I'm just now realizing, oh, I didn't really grow up like traditional Catholic. That was Marianist specifically. And if you didn't have that experience, it might have something to do with you having a negative feeling about the Catholic Church. So light bulbs constantly going off in my head. Just hearing you talk through that, I'm like, I hope people learn something from that too, even though it's not really the point of our lives. So speaking about patriarchy and matriarchy specifically, and this topic, it's really interesting because I grew up in a very traditional nuclear family for the most part. Of course, my parents were raised in homes where the father was the head of the household and the mother was a stay-at-home mom. And then in my home, same situation. My father was the head of the household. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. And I really think it was, my mom lived through the women's movement, and a lot of her peers and her friends were going to work, and part of that whole generation that was going back to work and being independent. And a lot of families were breaking up. So you had a lot of single moms out there who were the head of their own household for that reason. And I think what really drove my parents to stay in this traditional setup, um, patriarchal, setup,
Mm-hmm.
is their own experience growing up that their parents, both of my parents were divorced several times, and my parents were really determined to stay together no matter what, whether it was good, bad, ugly, and different. They were staying together, and that I think has a lot to do with why they chose to stay in that type of family setup. But it's what I knew growing up, and then I ended up marrying a Filipino who comes from a matriarchal society, which is very interesting too. There's a cultural aspect. So there's a familial aspect, there's a societal aspect, there's a cultural aspect to your views on matriarchy and patriarchy. And also, as Angela and I were discussing, there's the whole timing aspect. The women's movement happened. So, of course, it was more common before then to be patriarchal in the US. And after that, more towards equality, and then now headed towards matriarchal. But the more and more we talk about it, we're like, is it irrelevant? Like, does it matter? Is it inherently broken and, needs to be just not a thing anymore? So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I'm coming from.
So, thank you for that. Yeah, I definitely, again, I feel like us sharing our experiences, one, I would hope that people who are watching would go, hey, I can either relate to their experience, or I don't relate to that because I experienced something very different. And all of that's okay. Like, it is completely fine for people to have different experiences. Sometimes people can have the same experience and perceive it completely differently, and that's okay too,
I think
right?
people
But
sharing
mhm,
their context and their experience
mhm,
helps to reach an understanding. Because
right.
if I hear somebody just barge in a room and they're like, "This is how I think," and I'm like, "Well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you think that way?" And be
Mhm,
countering that. But if you hear their experience, you can, if they share their experience and their perspective, you can really go, "Okay, well, I don't feel that way, but I can certainly get why they feel that way based on what they've been through."
right.
So it really helps us all to reach an understanding, hopefully.
Hopefully, for sure. So, now that we have some of the context, I think, we can start to kind of move into sharing our opinions, and then maybe citing some examples of why, we feel the way that we feel, we have the opinion that we have. In terms of, Chris and I have obviously discussed this topic like every other topic at
We've had
nauseum.
a
And
lot of time to talk in 36 years.
so we do, I think, share similar views and opinions on this. But again,
Well,
our
and we
experiences,
grew up together, yeah,
right?
because our experiences are similar.
Yeah. But we could, have differences on this as well, which, that's as far as I'm concerned, having different opinions is a good thing. And it creates opportunities for learning. So, um, I will tell you right out the gate, when it comes to, and you probably picked up on this already because I described my experience of hierarchy or the lack thereof growing up, that I have a very strong and passionate view on believing that hierarchy, patriarchy, matriarchy, any of the archies are not a good thing. As a matter of fact, they are quite dangerous, in my opinion. Um, and the reason is because fundamentally it's built around this concept that having a characteristic that you're born into is somehow entitles you to be in a power position. It makes you somehow more valuable than somebody else who doesn't happen to possess that same born with quality. And I mean, if you bring it all the way back to like royalty, when royalty was based on this whole concept that just by being born into the right family automatically made you have more authority, more power, over other people, and made you more important. I mean, even if you think about it, like, of course, now and like, 2025 is hit here and go, how crazy is it that somebody being born is like, God chose me to be king? Like, it's like that when I would hear things like that, because my husband and I love to watch like historical fiction drama type of stuff. And I would, whenever I would see stuff like this, and I'd just be like, what? you think just because you were born into this particular family, you were like chosen by God? It just cracks
Well,
me
that
up.
can create a
Honestly, I
lot of
find it
problems because qualifications could go out the door
right,
and you could have
exactly.
a real moron leading a whole group of people. That's a
Which
problem.
history has proven was the case more often than not, right? Especially with the tremendous degree of incest that was going on typically but in the royal families, so you can kind of go that far back, but then you can kind of bring it to date and kind of look over, let's say specifically over the course of the last 50 years, that captures so many things around like civil rights movements and women's movement, all the things that have happened in terms of this progress towards equality, and this concept of like whether it's because you're, a man, that automatically makes you have more value and a more authority and more power, whether it's because you're a woman and it automatically makes you that, whether it's because you have a certain, shade of skin, that somehow makes you a greater power or authority over other people, whether it's because you participate in a certain religion or certain cults that are out there. Like this idea that just by existing and having and possessing a certain trait makes you more valuable than other people.
There's so
And so
many
to
so many rabbit holes I want to go down right now.
I'm
This could go,
sure.
yeah.
And it's so to me, I think just fundamentally, right? When you go back to kind of the basis and the premise behind the Archies, I'll just refer to it as that at this point. I just, to me, literally, it's broken right from the jump, right? It's, and it leads to what I think is a lot of really potentially awful things that could happen in terms of abuse, in terms of other really significant problems, and ignorance. I think that I've seen a lot of that come around it. So that's kind of my view. Kristen, what's your view in terms of your
I mean,
feeling about the Archies?
you make a really good point, tying, everything back to from you describing, royalty as to show an example of patriarchy or hierarchy, we'll call it, equally can happen in the home. So when I think about matriarchy and patriarchy, I think about the home, right? And should the man always be the head of the household? Is he the most qualified person to be the head of the household? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I
Mhm.
think we see a lot of roles shifting these days. There's a lot of, I don't have the right word, but there's a lot of households that the woman's working and the husband is a stay-at-home dad for a time being or for the long haul, whatever it is. A lot of it's shifting, and I think it's really, really good because we're looking at who is best in each role based on their skills, experience, personality, everything. Who is best fit for, who is the best candidate for each role. I'm talking recruiting lingo because I'm a recruiter, but who really is the most qualified and who's the right person to be in that seat. I think it's really important that we're looking at that instead of shade of skin, gender, class for societies in the world that
Economics,
still
yeah.
follow class system. Um, I think it's really good.
And I mean, it is interesting when you kind of think of all of the buzzwords and like political topics that are going on right now. I can't imagine that it's a coincidence, right? I can't imagine that there's a coincidence happening in terms of things around from civil rights movements in terms of, equality, diversity, all of these things that are being called into question, and then also a lot of conversation around patriarchy. I can't imagine that that's a coincidence in terms of like the political climate that we're living in right now. And I think in many ways, we're at a really like super super significant time in human history. I think that when you look back, in 100, 200, 300 years, and you look back to this specific time in history in terms of, the 21st and, 21st, 22nd centuries, like it's going to be one that is based on um, really like calling a lot into question and then saying, hey, like doing things just because that's the way it's always been done isn't enough of a reason to continue to do it, especially if it's causing e- pain and harm, to any human being, right? And I've always kind of talked about how probably one of our, and I did a video on this, so I'm not going to dive into this, but um, that one of the inherently broken things and characteristics in us as human beings is this like insatiable need to feel more important, to feel more valuable, to somehow be loved more, to be special, right? And I feel like what I noticed, again, this is my opinion, is that for people who didn't get that nurture and love and care and comfort and safety and all those fundamental things emotionally in terms of what they need from their parents as children, they would fight for it and literally kill for it when they became adults, right? And it would and that's a lot of this, like this desire and this demand for power that exists within human beings comes back to that. And so I think that, like, just that one aspect and that one characteristic that's unfortunately a very predominant characteristics in human beings, period, is what drives something like the archies. It drives the hierarchies, it drives the patriarchies, it drives the matriarchies, and I think that that is something that's really driven, is just like, I need to feel more special. I need to feel more important. And I think what's tough, in terms of like my view on this for me is that because, and I always make sure I give credit where credit's due. I have and had two incredible parents who, I got to tell you, I didn't spend a single day of my life in question as to whether or not I was the most important thing to them. Like, I knew that, instinctively my whole life. Did that make them perfect? Heck no. They were human beings. They made plenty of mistakes. But actually, what's interesting is the fact that I knew that I was so important to them left space for grace and for forgiveness for them when they would make bad choices, when they would make mistakes. Like, it left that space in there, and they left that space for me too. And but I think if you have that foundation, then you don't really go on the rest of your life going, I need to feel more important
And
than
trying
other
to prove it.
people. I
I
need to
actually was just
feel.
thinking about our parents before you said anything about your parents. I was thinking our parents did something right in the way that they were raised